Now, the Competition Commission will fine 15 construction groups the total sum of 1.46 billion rand. That's to settle a multi-year investigation of bid rigging in the sector. Many of those companies had agreed to cooperate with the Commission in exchange for lighter fines. And Deputy Commissioner of the Competition Commission, Trudy Makaya, had this to say earlier on the apportionment of that fine between those 15 groups.
You know, the penalties will reflect, you know, the size of the company, the number of projects they've been found to have rigged, and kind of lots of variables we took into account in determining a penalty for each firm. But I mean, intuitively, it would all be driven by the size or the number of projects that the firm rigged versus how much they got leniency for. They only got leniency for contraventions where they were the first to disclose information. So it's that trade-off versus obviously how serious the contraventions were.
Well, for a more detailed look at this, we're joined now by Hugan Chetty, who is fund manager at Imara SP Reed. Hi, Hugan. Now, I sense a sense of relief in the sector that it's not worse. I mean, 1.46 billion is a lot of money. And one of the numbers that's come out, they were investigating 65 bid rigging cases, value of close to 30 billion since 2009. That's just one of these eye-watering statistics that come out of this deal. But it could have been worse by the sounds of it, for the companies.
For the companies, I think, yes, it could have been worse. I think the total value of the fines that the guys were probably going to be charged with was about 4 billion rand plus. And I think coming out with 1.5 billion rand in total is a relief to these guys. And the fines had been overhanged over the construction industry. It was like a dark cloud sitting over there. No one knew what was happening. It initially started off as a fast-track process, and it took almost 2 years to get finalized. And I think now that the fines are finalized, the fines are out there, the companies can go out and pay the fines to see there is leniency periods where the guys can pay it off over, if we look at Avenge, they can pay it over a 3-year period starting 30 days from today. I think Wilson Bailey is the same. Basil Reed's got 2 payments that they can make. So they have.
So do we know all the numbers for each company now?
Yes, I think if we look at in terms of the fines, what has been given, I think most of the companies are out. There's 3 companies that have not accepted the settlement, which is Group 5, Power Construction, and there's another firm that I cannot get the name right now. But they have not accepted the settlement. But in my view, if we're talking around, Group 5 would have been the one with the least fine. So I don't see why they didn't agree just to settle and get it over them and move forward with it. I would have expected Group 5 to the one to say, yes, let's just get this over and done with so we can move on a clean slate.
But Hugan, weren't they the people who came initially?
Yes.
I think they were the one who got the leniency
Yes.
for coming forward, and I think that's why they're still trying to settle that out there.
But their fine's going to be nothing as opposed to what these guys. I don't think their fine will be more than 30 million, if that.
But are they operating on principle here? They're saying, hey, we blew the whistle on this, now you're still punishing us.
But sure, you blew the whistle on it, but you were also involved in it. You need to pay the penalty for some of the fines. So, and I think the fines that they've been, the contracts that they've been charged for, the ones that they probably left out, like some of the other guys probably did, and that's what they're getting charged for.
I want, Kevin?
Do you think there will be a reform now in the industry? In other words,
is it worse? Is it bad enough to stop them doing it again?
Well, that was one of the questions that was posed to one of the CEOs of a listed company earlier, and his view was yes, from what I read from it. But again, will it stop? It's to see, because again, the fines are not as hectic as it was. To give them that leniency.
In other words, what I wanted to ask was this specific to the World Cup in terms of trying to get the World Cup events organized, to make sure the contracts were dealt with? Is there any legitimacy to putting that argument
I think it's
forward?
more than just the World Cup projects, because this has been going on for 50 years. Okay, so I think a lot of the smaller guys probably
the World Cup felt like it was going on for 50 years.
David, if you look at the list, I think there was a women's res in University of Cape Town, so it went as far as that. So there were a number of projects.
Carry on.
So my view is that I think a lot of the smaller guys probably thought, oh, we're not getting a piece of this big action. So I think it was probably a smaller company that went in and sparked this and said, they lit the fire, and someone just threw petrol on it, and it just got bigger and bigger, and which is a good thing because it cleans up the industry, so the guys can move forward from there.
I want to throw in a devil's advocate, if you like, on behalf of the sector. I've spoken to a couple of the chief executives. Not necessarily they won't say it in public. They say, look, there's some practices in the industry we need to cooperate, collaborate, not collude. Big projects in this industry, we need to work together. Now, I suppose then you say, well, what about if the price was inflated because you worked together? So, Is there anything to be said for the construction companies? And it's another way of asking David's question. Is there any mitigation here? And perhaps they've come, you said, look, we actually could argue this case if we wanted to, but let's get it out the way and just pay.
To answer it, I think that there's no mitigation to it. It will probably happen again. It's probably not going to stop. It's probably not a plug put on it where it says it's done, it's over, it's dusted. If something big happens again, government speaks of 800 and some odd billion rand worth of work coming out. If you see a spurt of work coming out again, like we saw before the World Cup, who's to say they're not going to do it again? Everyone wants to make money out there. So,
well, I mean, it's surely much more difficult to do now, Kevin.
but I'm sure they'll find ways to it.
I would have thought that having gone through this process, there would be clearer oversight as to further tendering, and there is a lot of construction work that is upcoming. What we've got to make sure is that obviously we have construction companies that can do the work. In other words, I'm pleased that the fine was not so large that it effectively put companies out of business. I don't think there would have been any upside to that. So this is still the largest fine the Competition Commission has ever launched in terms of a particular industry. So it's still huge, but at least these companies, from what I understand, can absorb the cost and can move forward. I suspect they'll be looked at more carefully in terms of how they bid for future contracts. And ultimately, it does hurt the country. You can't have a situation where contracts are simply inflated in order to help particular companies that may or may not be vital for the production of these contracts. So I think that I would hope that the practice ceases.
The one thing that we're not sure is whether these companies are absolved from any kind of litigation or action. You know, I as a shareholder would be quite angry, you know, to find that 300 million is just gone. You know, which...
so if I understand what you're trying to ask correctly, is can these companies get charged by...
In civil
yes, from what I've been speaking to people around in the industry, the local governments can go back to these companies now and put civil claims against them. So yes, there could be more action coming for them.
Well, the market, particularly in the case of Avenge, on a day when the whole market went down 2.5%, Avenge up 5%, Wilson Bailey Homes up 2%. So they are saying, phew, as far as Avenge goes.
I think it removes the
again,
uncertainty.
But it doesn't, from what the question you've just asked.
But if you look at the one that's outstanding, if you look at something like Group 5 was down today because they didn't accept their fine. So I think that's a negative on them. Had they done that, we would have seen all these stocks have the uptick and regain some of the losses that they had made over the past 2-3 years.
Can I ask you now, from this point going forward, how do the order books look a bit better? Are construction companies, okay, we've got the fines out of the way.
Out of the way, yes.
Is there a more optimistic view going forward about work margins, profitability?
Yes, I think there is a more optimistic view out there. I think the light's at the end of the tunnel, but if we look at the local construction side, it's still a bit dead. The guys are on very thin margins, if that, or not making any money on the local side. And the guys are benefiting from their offshore operations or from Africa or other diversified business that they may have. So locally, I think that once we see the projects coming out from government, that will benefit these guys. And a lot of the guys, if you look at Avengers, also gearing up for the energy sector, so with the power stations and so forth. I think that will benefit. Once we see all these projects coming onto the market, that will give more insight and expand margins a bit.
Isn't there a danger of bureaucratic stifling because of concern about this? So companies desperate to prove that they're not colluding, all the paperwork. I heard a story about the Gautrain. There were 60,000 different contracts, clauses, documents that had to be signed. I mean, it sounds like you could collapse under the weight of the paper, let alone the bridge.
That's true. I agree with you. There is a lot in the I think the tendering process now will become more rigorous. So I think if the tenders are going out, people are going to monitor that much more carefully as opposed to what previously happened. Because again, if you look at pre-World Cup, you had a lot of tenders coming out. So you had a tender that came out, you didn't really go through it with a fine-tooth comb. You kind of said, okay, this is the cheapest one, let's do it. We're going with this company. So I think the process is getting more rigorous, and you're seeing now also that if you look at tender activities, the number of companies that are bidding are reducing. So I think the process is becoming more formalized.
Well, fewer people possibly means higher prices. David, just to wrap up on this, construction as a sector to invest in?
I still holding back. I still think it's far too early. You know, I agree with Hugo, and I think that if we look at the offshore order book, that is escalating quite healthily. But I think the local side still a worry for me.
I agree with David. The local side is a big concern, and I'd probably start looking at construction stocks 8 months to a year out from now. But that's just looking at it, not investing in it. Because if we look in the next, if we take into account the fines, and from what I understand that these fines will only come into the next 6 months results, we're going to see a bad set of results coming out of these companies. So taking into account the count, so it's going to hurt the earnings of these companies.
What you don't want is companies saying we'd rather not bid because it's too difficult and it's too expensive and it's too risky. Like Avenge was relieved not to get the Gautrain. When in 2005 when it was awarded. But we'll have to stop there. That's Hugo Chetty, fund manager at Imara SP Reid, giving specific advice and analysis on the construction sector.